Hello everyone, welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming to this evening's event, which is in association with BBC Arabic and Free Speech Debate. Before I hand over to Sina Motalebi, who's chairing this evening, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live. So I'll hand over to Sina.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming here. And first I need to apologize because, as I said to the panel, this is the first time I'm moderating a discussion here. I have been here as a panelist before, but this is totally new to me. Fortunately, we have a very experienced, esteemed panel here that the great audience can help me. Here we are with one of the Frontline Club's discussion in association with BBC. People, the audience who are watching this on live stream can join the discussions on Twitter with the hashtag FCBBCA. And we will have opening comments from the member of panel, and after the discussion, it will be open to the floor to ask questions. First, I want to ask Mr. Timothy Garton Ash if you can open with your comments.
Thank you very much, Sina. Well, it's great to be doing this here, and we've been given 5 minutes each. So I've got 5 minutes to present a project that's been about 5 years in the making and is now presented in 13 languages. So this is the Reduced Shakespeare Company. I'm going to follow, as you know, the first law of journalism, which is first simplify, then exaggerate. The starting point of this project is the proposition that we are all neighbors now. If we live in a city like London, there are people from every country, culture, religion, language in the world. More than 300 languages are spoken in London. In addition to which, 4 billion people are at least theoretically connected either on the internet, 2 billion, or another 2 billion by mobile phone. So we're all becoming neighbors with each other. And what that means is that the old way of thinking about free speech, which was, again, with great oversimplification, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you're in the US, you have the First Amendment tradition. If you're in England, you have common law. If you're in China, you have whatever passes for law in China, and so on, breaks down. Not completely, because powerful sovereign states like China and Iran do try to reassert their sovereignty and control over the internet and over the flow of information and ideas, but with considerable difficulty and at great expense. So what that means is, first of all, we have to have a conversation, a global conversation, about what should be the norms, the underlying principles for our living together in terms of freedom of expression. Secondly, what this means, and there's a website up there in the 13 languages, what this connectedness on the internet means is that in this brave new world, private powers are at least as important as public powers. What Google does on the world of the internet is more important than what Germany does. Facebook, if it were a country, would be the third largest country in the world, 850 million people. What Facebook does is much more important than what France does. And they set the rules, with all respect to France, and they set the rules without any democratic process. The privacy settings on Facebook are not arrived at by a democratic process. So we need a conversation about that too, but the internet also allows new possibilities for what I would call online self-governing communities, where people actually set their own rules for their chosen community. So what we've tried to do in this project out of Oxford, but with a very international team, is to lay out, I was trying them on you in several different languages, but there they are in English, 10 draft principles. And I emphasize draft principles for discussion, looking at the key areas of freedom of expression and freedom of information, and trying to ask what should be the basic underlying principle, the rule of thumb, which may then be implemented by law, or it may be implemented in the private standards of an internet service provider, or editorial standards or community standards, and then inviting an online debate. As you can see, the next line says, what's missing? This is presented in 13 languages, which at least in theory would reach more than 80% of the world's internet users. There it is in Chinese. If your Chinese is a little rusty, there it is in something that may be more familiar, and so on. Now, that's in Farsi, there it is in Arabic. Now, we then, obviously these are just broad general principles, we then have a series of analyses, discussions, and a great many individual case studies. There are just a few of the case studies which are constantly updated, which test the general principles against the specific hard cases. I've been swanning around the world talking about this project in Germany, most recently in Poland, in China. Some of you will know a famous book called Reading Lolita in Tehran. After talking about free speech in China, I felt I should do an essay called Reading John Stuart Mill in Beijing. It was a very interesting experience, but it is possible. In Egypt, where Khaled Fahmy organized an absolutely riveting discussion just off Tahrir Square with Egyptian bloggers, journalists, academics, civil society activists who'd been on the front line of the struggle for free expression in the Egyptian revolution. I'm just going to make very, very quickly a couple of, as it were, points about questions that have been directed at us, and then throw it open for the rest of the panel. Number one, I think Khaled would agree, one of the points that came up again and again in that discussion was, this is all incredibly abstract and general, and it's all very fine for you in Oxford, but here we are in Cairo, in the Middle East, absolutely on the front line of the struggle for free expression. What use are these general principles? To which I think an answer, and I'd like to hear Khaled on this, is you can't really make the judgment on the particular immediate case whether that blogger should be entitled to say that abusive thing or not, whether this or that comment about Islam or some other religion should or should not be permitted, unless you have some broader framework for thinking about it in universal terms. I think that's a defense of the project, but obviously that was one of the points. The second obvious objection is, isn't this Western liberal imperialism, right? You guys there from Oxford coming to tell us what the rules of the game are. To which the answer is no. And it's no for two reasons. Number one, because the team that has drafted this is genuinely international, multinational. We have native speakers of the 13 languages. We have experts from many countries. Secondly, if you don't like them, come and tell us how we should change them. And we will, in 2 weeks' time, be putting up an actually revised set of draft principles based on the debate so far. The third objection is, what's wrong with doing it our way in China or India or wherever it might be? For example, the Indian MPs to whom I presented this project took our Principle 7, which I personally am rather fond of, which is how do we talk about religion? We respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. I think it's a really key distinction. There are some of the case studies. All the Indian MPs, from left to right, religious and non-religious, said, this is totally impossible in India. Absolutely won't work, right? Can't do it. They said, all the rest we can more or less accept, but your Principle 7 is absolutely out. By the way, with two very different arguments. One argument was, in principle, if you insult the Hindus' sacred objects or tenets of their faith, you are insulting them as a human being, so your principle doesn't work. The other objection was quite different. It was, you may do that there, but you can't do it here because people will end up killing each other. Now, the implications of those two different propositions are actually very different. One is you might move towards a society in which it is possible. The other is you won't. Okay, so for India, maybe that doesn't work. Well, then the question becomes, maybe on this matter, India can do it differently. Maybe Egypt or Iran could have a different tenet on this principle if that is arrived at by a genuinely democratic process with the rule of law. So if that is a possibility you have in Egypt, and obviously don't have in Iran, but do have in India, then that is in principle fine. Then the only question becomes, and with this I finish and hand over, so what about all the stuff that is flowing across your frontiers through the internet, through mobile phones, through social media, through satellite TV? And that, I think, is then a really interesting question to which there are several different possible answers, which perhaps I'll come to in the discussion. So the proposition here, with which I finish, is not these are 10 binding commandments for all humankind. They're 10 draft principles for discussion, for debate, and it is entirely possible that in different countries you may choose to do differently in different areas. And then the question remains, what do you do about the information and ideas that will flow across your frontiers? What do you do about the online edition of Salman Rushdie? What do you do about the Mohammed cartoons? And so on. And with that, I think I'll hand it on to the rest of the panel. Thanks.
With that note, can I ask Mr. Khaled Fahmy from the professor and chair of University of American University in Cairo's history department to open?
Sure. Well, yes, and please tell me if I'm going over my time. On the surface, I have a much easier task limiting my comments to 5 minutes than Timothy did.
Which I failed to do, I hate to add.
Because he was speaking about events that happened over 5 years and he had to summarize in 5 minutes. I have only things to talk about regarding 15 months. But what 15 months in Egypt? 15 months that we've witnessed in them things that we haven't witnessed in a generation, if not more. So I'm not going to summarize the revolution. I don't need to for this audience, obviously, but I just want to maybe start by saying something about how important Facebook was. Not the common story that I'm sure all of you know, but that even before Facebook, I think what made this revolution, at least in Egypt, possible is the degree of openness to which the media has been enjoying for the past maybe 7-8 years. Traditional media, print media and TV, very, very significant opening. And this is one of the questions that had been eclipsed by the so-called Facebook phenomenon. But this is a very serious question of why the regime took that decision and who and how it was carried out. We didn't have a media, and literally overnight, about 7-8 years ago, we had private TV companies, we had private independent newspapers that really made a big, big difference in opening up the political arena and in shaping public consciousness and establishing a new public sphere. So that's one thing that I'd like to say. And then the other thing is that in my mind, regarding the Egyptian revolution, it definitely is not a revolution of the poor and hungry. I mean, that is one dimension of it, but I think it's a revolution in which principles lie at the very core of it, and one of them is open access to information. This is what made people so angry when the plug was pulled on the internet in the 3 days in the beginning of the revolution. They just thought that this is something that governments should not and cannot be allowed to do. And so many details about the revolution in the early stages were intricately connected to access to information. The famous icon of the revolution, Khaled Said, the young blogger who was tortured to death, he became the icon because of Facebook and because of the ability, and this was not an isolated incident, just became a key one for a number of interesting circumstances, that torture should now be made public. Cases of torture will not be hushed. And it's the bloggers and Facebook activists who made Khaled Said and many other people and the torture they have been subjected to really a national issue. And people identified, and it is no accident that the revolution broke out on 25th of January, which is Police Day, to humiliate the police and to tell them this is something you cannot do. That aspect of the need to inform was central in the revolution. But the interesting thing is that throughout the past 15 months, we toppled Mubarak, but the regime is still very much there, and the deep state, as it is this is a household term in Egypt, is very much hitting back with a vengeance. And it is through information and through social media that and new kinds of ways to highlight the atrocities committed by the security forces. And the most interesting example is one that Free Speech Debate has on their as one of the case studies, Askar Kadibun, the military liars, or the military are lying, to take videos to the streets and show people in cafes and passers-by what the military had been doing to refute the official narrative of what is happening. I have two further points to make. One in response to what Timothy is saying about the event that happened in Egypt. One of the interesting things, that this was a fascinating debate or encounter between Timothy and his project and these young bloggers who were reluctant to engage with these questions. And part of the reluctance came from what Timothy was speaking about. These are principles set down in Oxford, and we are doing the real struggle. But I think the deeper problem in my reading of that particular evening was that we are in the middle of a revolution in which the rules of the game are changing every single day. And the rules of the game regarding many things, including information, how to have access to it, how to read, how to assess, how to evaluate, how to share information, what is to be censored, what is not to be censored. We are, that aspect of the revolution is very much central. And it's interesting, and this will be my last point, to then say that unlike, and again, I don't think this audience needs to be reminded of this, but I will say it anyway. It's a nice, maybe dead horse to beat. But it's not really Islamists, in my mind, that pose the most serious threat to freedom of information. But it's the military, and it's the military with all that is attached to it, mostly the security apparatuses. And one interesting example of how serious they are taking this aspect of freedom of information and free access to information and freedom of expression revolves around a bill to have a new Freedom of Information Act in Egypt, a bill that I've worked on, like many of my colleagues, over the past summer, only to be surprised by the government version of what they did with our bill, and they basically are trying to kill it, mostly by privileging national security, by deferring to deep state institutions, mostly military intelligence, in adjudicating important cases regarding freedom of information and free access to information, establishing a new National Council for Information, which is what we've been calling for, but that National Council would defer to the military when they suspect that some cases might jeopardize national security. So it is the military that we're fighting, and it's the national security that we need to challenge.
Thank you. And Marie Gillespie, Professor of Sociology at the Open University and co-director of the Center for Research on Social Ecology and Cultural Change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been involved in over the last year, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And we've been looking at the BBC Arabic service and the difference that social media makes to the kind of journalism that they do. And for me, this raises three issues that are relevant to this debate. The first one is about the difference between the ideal public sphere and the empirical public sphere, and what the proper relationship between those two conceptions are. And it's quite clear that the empirical public sphere is quite often miles away from that ideal normative public sphere that is expressed in Timothy's 10 not commandments then.
And not Timothy's, but above
not
that.
Timothy's. But I suppose I'd like to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here, and to throw open a bit later the question of what this relationship is between a normative ideal public sphere and an empirical one. And the second point I'd like to raise is how what's the relationship between big media, international broadcasters like the BBC, CNN and Al Jazeera, and small media, this kind of social media that are available. So I'm kind of shifting the frame a little bit. And I want to just tell you a little bit about the research we've done over the last year with a team of 5 Arabic researchers who've been either based in BBC Arabic or looking at who's talking to who and who's listening online, and looking also at the vast amounts of social media monitoring data that now these kind of social media produce. Facebook Analytics, other tools like Site Catalyst and Sysomos, these are kind of monitoring everything that people do online. So the BBC World Service has unprecedented access to what people do, what they like, what's trending, what's not. Well, let me just give you a few of the headlines of what we've found about the empirical public sphere at BBC Arabic. We look particularly at the flagship discussion programme called Talking Point, or Nukta Tarwar, and that's a tri-media programme that goes out 5 times a week. It's a political debate show that in principle the topics of debate should be decided by the users of social media, the people, not just social media, but the people who phone in, the people who go on the website, or the people who through Facebook or Twitter presents the production team with ideas and suggestions for debates. I can talk a little bit more about the process of engaging users, but let me just give you the headlines, because I think that it's much more difficult to engage people in social media and get users to frame the debate than perhaps in principle we think it is. And so what we've found is that in general, those people who are involved in using new media over 77% are male. The large majority of them are also young, within the 18 to 35 year group. The majority of people are coming from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And when you look much more closely at who's talking to, whether there is actually a dialogue going on, we find that most people using many of these forums, they're engaging in a kind of monologue rather than a dialogue. So I think this raises very important questions as to what people are calling the media revolution, whether we are all connected, whether we are all neighbours. And I suppose what I would say in response maybe to Timothy or to the kind of lines of argument that I've seen on the website is that the structural inequalities that exist in the world are replicated and sometimes intensified online. So I think I would be asking who's talking to who, and most importantly, who's listening.
Very good. Thank you. And Kirsty Hughes from the Chief Executive of Index on Censorship. Can you please?
Okay, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here and to be part of this panel, and I'm glad to see we're not 70% male or all under 35 or any of those things, and hopefully it's not monologues. And I was also going to say I've only been Chief Executive at Index for a month, so 5 years, 15 months, one month. But that also made me think, listening to the others, that, Timothy and I met in the 90s when we were both focusing a lot on European issues, and I quite by chance managed to be in a research institute in Berlin in the autumn of 1989, so I saw some of that revolution start. I also happened to be, again by chance really, in Nepal before and after the People's Movement 5 years ago, and then of course we've all watched with both wonder and horror at various dimensions of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. But I think what's wonderful about all those different things is again and again we see people want economic freedom of some sort, but they also want those political freedoms, those freedoms of expression, freedom of assembly. The right to protest is also part of that universal declaration of human rights. And a lot of what we see that's bad is old, it's familiar, it's nasty, it's horribly familiar. Some of what we see is old but very welcome, that revolution, that spirit that wants freedom. And some of it is new, as we're starting in a sense to unwrap and debate, I think, at the moment. In terms, some of what we're talking about in social media, it's not new, but some of it is new, that huge information out there about a lot of us. I don't think we've particularly heard the word privacy tonight. And when I got to Index just a month ago and I was starting to talk about some of the issues around privacy in the UK, we're talking about, or the government is talking about having what's been labelled a snoopers charter. The Eastern European revolutions, they were about people not recording your private conversations. So sometimes these things are in opposition, but I think privacy and freedom of expression also go together. I wanted to come at this in just a slightly different way, but I think it fits in well with what's already been said, and highlight what for me are 5 of the biggest international issues around freedom of expression today. And then I was going to say a little bit at the end about, well, the way the preamble for tonight was set up, which said, do we want a global code? Tim might tell us whether he thinks that's the right way to summarize his 10 principles, but just some very brief comments on that. So my first big issue is some of the religious and cultural pressures on free expression around the world. Tim mentioned India, but if you look back in this country a few years and you saw the play Beheshti being shut down in Birmingham, it was well within UK laws, but it ran into social protests which were turning violent. Also, if you talk, I was also myself going to mention India, though, if you talk to the Facebooks and Googles, they will tell you that they are getting into problems in India in terms of the extent of takedown notices they are getting for political, cultural and religious reasons. So I think there's a lot of issues to unwrap there. And I think we also see governments, often the ones we might expect, the more authoritarian ones, trying to go through UN processes as well and use culture and religion to inhibit freedom of expression. There was an infamous resolution adopted 2 years ago at the Human Rights Council against defaming religion. There was one 3 years ago on trying to talk about traditional values as being part of human rights. If you look at who supported that one, it was Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, sadly too, India and South Africa. And Egypt. So there's a range of issues there, and I think Tim is quite right to also bring up the issue of how much does that differ by country, because we must remember that freedom of expression is a fundamental right. It's not an absolute right, like the right not to be tortured. There are some restrictions, but they're meant to be proportionate, limited, absolutely necessary, and so on. But what does that do in different countries? What are the national security arguments in different countries? And then if it's international, we have universal rights, we have the internet, so what does that add up to? And just leave that as a question. A second big issue I'll say less about, but obviously we've still got, in a sense, the classic senses, the totalitarian, the authoritarian regimes around the world, and whether that's online or offline, whether it's Iran, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, China, you know, the list goes on. Those very classic, really problematic regimes are still there. My third heading, it also links a bit to what Khalid was just saying, is about national security and public order being used as excuses to close down and really narrow the freedom of expression space. That can happen in democracies, in quasi-democracies, in countries transitioning into democracies, and whether it's the London riots or the India's takedown demands, the Snoopers Charter, Turkey, supposedly a model for democracy in its region, imprisoning more journalists than almost anyone else in the world. And that's not to say there are never security and public order issues, but they are again and again used as excuses to close down that space. Fourth, my big issues, the digital space, which I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about tonight. So I'll just 3 quick points under that digital space, which in some ways has allowed wonderful conversations, but of course it's also being used by criminals for piracy, a lot of issues around copyright. One sub-issue, what about the stronger and weaker filters being imposed? What do we think about the different filters? Whether we're talking about the Chinese firewall, the current media panic in the UK about child protection, should we opt in or opt out of adult content, but actually that will make a lot of other sites blocked and not just pornography. I worked in an organisation a couple of years ago that put some filters onto what we could look at, and we suddenly found you were looking for sites about arms exports around the world, and we couldn't get to them. So filters do things you don't always expect them to do. Another issue, privatisation of freedom of expression. Again, I think Tim mentioned that in effect in his opening comments. The standards and conventions that the Facebooks and others are using for their walled gardens. And we can have one convention here and another convention if we hold a meeting at Index. But if you've got your 800 million users, then you're starting to sort of really set international standards in some ways. Last but not least, by any means, I think, and it comes back to this question of code or principles, what we want at an international level. Do we want the whole of the internet regulated top-down by some government agreement around the world? Because it's not the way it came to where we are today. And there are pressures for that, and again, some of the pressures for that are coming from the governments who are most against freedom of expression. And if you look forward to the end of this year, there's a big international telecoms summit in Dubai. It's looking at the 1988 treaty that regulated international telecoms. If it extends that to the internet, you've potentially got a completely new governmental, top-down, not something involving lots of different stakeholders. Very, very worrying, I think. Last but not least, and I think it links to what Mari was saying, my fifth big issue, I don't have time to go into it, but what I've just labelled in my notes, the excluded. And again, whether we're talking about democracies or oppressive societies, lots of people are excluded from real freedom of speech. Someone mentioned already the access to digital conversations. What about literacy and illiteracy? What about minorities or even sometimes majorities in some countries that are particularly oppressed, or the position of women or poor women. Or there's a lot of categories of people, and we don't always think about them when we're talking about freedom of expression. So I'm coming to a conclusion. And maybe just to be a little bit provocative, I think Tim shook his head when I said, did he mean a global code? Because that was what it was in the preamble to this meeting.
A negative shake, yes.
So my answer was, do we need a global code? No, we don't need a global code. We've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've got Article 19. We've got the regional human rights declarations. But yes, we do need to fight to promote and defend freedom of expression. We need to look at the new challenges that the web and digital monitoring and censorship poses. We need to look at the actors, the pippers, the soppers, the security issues, the illegality, the indecency issues. But I think codes not only open up the possibility of government interference and top-down regulation, they can also lead to, again, another issue that has not come up yet tonight, self-censorship. And I think self-censorship is a fascinating and problematic issue, and there's self-censorship in the UK, there's self-censorship in countries that are much more oppressive, and there's a set of issues that do relate to the 10 principles, code or not, about the right to cause offence. Is my frankness your anger? The points about beliefs and the believer that Tim brought up. So yeah, let's have the global conversation. Let's debate what it means in the internet age. But let's not have a code.
Can we have the conversation without having a code?
Absolutely. Heaven save us from having a UN code imposed upon us. Here we have Article 19, freedom of expression, anchored in international law. There's the map. You can see the countries in yellow have both signed and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So most countries in the world have actually signed and ratified. China has signed but not ratified. To that extent, we do have a global code, but perish the thought that we should have a lowest common multiple UN-imposed code. We need a discussion about global norms, which we can realize in different kinds of self-governing communities. That's the philosophy behind this. I thought what you said it was absolutely fascinating, the difference between the sort of Habermasian normative public sphere and the empirical, the actual reality. It is extremely difficult to get people to engage in open and civilized debate. You know this on BBC Farsi. We find this. This map is a distribution of articles on Wikipedia. You can't see it very well, but the blocks on the left are US and Canada. Then in the middle is basically Western Europe, and that tiny, tiny block on the right is the whole rest of the world. So it's much less than half the world which is being written about by much less than half the world. Huge structural inequalities. The 4 billion figure is, of course, a journalistic exaggeration. This is a theoretical possibility. The fact that you can reach more than 80% of the world's online conversation with just 13 languages illustrates the point precisely. There are all sorts of inequalities. That's why our version of Article 19 adds a word, a really important word. We, all human beings, must be free and able to express ourselves, right? So that's not in Article 19, but it's essential. You have actually to have the internet access, the media access, the basic education. Very quickly, final point. One of the things that already came up in just the first 3 months of this project is from anyone who's lived in an authoritarian country or developing country. What Khaled said about access to information is absolutely crucial to empowerment. The theoretical freedom of expression without the practical access to information does not give you the ability. So that's one of the big points that's already emerged, I think. And that came, by the way, it comes from China, it comes from India, it comes from both developing and authoritarian countries.
The issue of excluded people inside the society or in global conversation came up in the discussions. You mentioned Noktatol Havar Talking Point. We have a similar program in our Persian Interactive, which is your turn. And we experienced that when you get people's comments in different platforms, you get different response. So the response you get about Arab Israel on your web or in Facebook is totally different than what you get through SMS messages from faraway provinces. So what do you think you do? Because when we talk about this revolution, media revolution that you said, maybe you have some doubts about it, that is actually a revolution there, because still some people are excluded from the conversation. I think part of this revolution can be convergence of media, the traditional form of media, as Khaled mentioned, in Egypt 7 years even before the Arab Spring, and the new media. Is it possible to bring in the excluded people by converging different platforms, which different types of people and different layers of society have access to?
I think that's a very interesting point, and our research found that the quality of debate on the Have Your Say forums was very, very different to on the Facebook. On Have Your Say, it was an older group. They tended to debate using evidence, using rational argument, no profanity, no swear words. Facebook, it was an entirely different type of discourse. There was a lot of swearing, a lot of profanity, etc. So these two groups of people on the different social media don't actually talk to each other. And despite convergence, what you actually have at BBC Arabic is a split publics or split audiences, because you have the 30 million people in the Middle East and diasporas who actually watch the TV programme. Well, they're not the same people who are using Facebook, who are trying to shape the debate. And you'll find, so there are huge differences between the different groups using the different platforms, even in an age of convergent media.
And your point about the traditional media and social media reminds me of this question, because during the Arab Spring, everybody was talking about Tahrir Square, and that was where bloggers were talking about, and they set the agenda for news organizations. But later we realized that it was way beyond Tahrir Square. It was not those people. There were different groups of society being involved. How those people can find a voice when bloggers, middle class educated people dominate the social media?
Well, there are 2 points here that I'd like to make. One is related to the point of freedom of assembly, because I think Tahrir is an interesting place. There's a connection with this country, actually. Tahrir became Tahrir, this huge empty space in the middle of the city, because it was the grounds of the British Army barracks that was evacuated in 1949, when the city had already started to expand to the other, around it. So what started was as an off-limits area became the heart of the city. But the association with oppression, with occupation, with the military, with power was always there. So it was not accidental that people instinctively went to Tahrir to demonstrate, but also to congregate, to meet, to talk, to discuss, because like many Arab cities, and this is again is the significance of new media, like many Arab cities, people didn't meet. They didn't meet in clubs like this. They didn't meet in the street. The streets were designed and the public squares are designed in such a way as to make conversation impossible, let alone demonstrations. So that was the significance of what happened in Tahrir. But what happened in Tahrir was replicated in various, the taboo of the security forces controlling the public sphere was broken, and Tahrir was replicated all over. But interestingly, on the 29th of July, when the Salafis took to Tahrir physically, not the other smaller Tahrir squares throughout the country, when they actually were bussed into Cairo to take Tahrir, the Tahrir crowd were disenchanted. You know, they said, no, that's our square, and you cannot come and take it. And I personally was delighted to see them, because it was an exercise in democracy that we will take to the streets and we will make our voice heard. So this is one point regarding the different groups and their access to media. We have to realize that. Again, to confuse things, the Salafis became famous because, of course, of the election victory, 24% of the vote, but also because they broke so many stereotypical ideas, both on the real streets, but also in the virtual media. The Salafis, who are depicted as extremists and medievalists, and mostly depicted as such by Facebook crowds, form their own clubs, and the most famous of them is the Salafis of Costa, because they congregated in Costa coffee shops. And they speak English and French, and they have their laptops, and they have their websites. So it's important to realize that a huge vehicle for mobilization of Islam is Salafis and Muslim Brotherhoods and others through their blogs and their Facebook pages. And there is another world. I mean, it's a parallel. Facebook is as diverse and as divided, actually, because of the way Facebook functions. You know, you friend like-minded people, and you delete people who intrude on your space. So there's millions and millions of Salafis on Facebook that talk only to each other, and with very little conversation.
I mean, picking up on that and some of what's been said. I mean, I think what's interesting is, yes, to some extent these conversations are very segmented. But to some extent, you know, there was a story maybe it was on the BBC anyway, in the British press the other day about, oh yeah, people get their media on the whole now and their news from a variety of sources. We don't have our daily newspaper. It's a fairly obvious point. So we're going to different fora. And I was talking to someone from one of the major television broadcasters the other day, and they were saying to me, we have different comment policies according to whether it's our own website, whether it's Facebook, whether it's YouTube, and on some of them we moderate, some we don't, some of them we don't have a comment stream, and people are, or it's a question in a way to Marie and maybe a challenge to Tim, you know, people are jumping around different conversations. There was also something in a news article the other day, a British police chief was commenting on the way that social network communities are regulating their own debates. To my surprise, I found myself agreeing with him. So do we need the same standards for all these different conversations? Why can't we have different standards and self-managing? Although having said that, I also then wanted to challenge Tim, if I can, going back to something he said at the start about, well, if India democratically agrees that they're not going to challenge beliefs and so on, that's fine. Well, I'm not sure that's fine. Can we repudiate universal rights democratically? I'm not sure we can.
No, but I don't think that the Indian culture of mutual respect for religions would be seen as a violation of basic human rights. Of course we should have basic universal human rights. But while respecting basic universal human rights, we could certainly agree a culture of more mutual respect for religion, I think. But then you have the borderline cases like Salman Rushdie and Jaipur. But an awful lot of that stuff actually comes back to incitement to violence. I mean, if the taboo is actually enforced on incitement to violence, then major differences can be articulated.
But I think it's more than just borderline. I mean, because Salman Rushdie is a case of principle, but also if you know this fact that a lot of the big Googles and Facebooks are particularly facing problems in India. So it's Indians posting stuff that then needs to be taken down again. So there's obviously implicit in that some difference of view in India about
well,
this.
Here's the thing. So Germany, by law, criminalizes Holocaust denial. So if you go on google.de, the German Google site, you will not see explicit Holocaust denial or Nazi insignia. But one click away for anyone in Germany is google.com, where all of this is available. And the question is that a reasonable compromise or not? From the point of view of, as it were, total consistency, it clearly isn't, because if these are the values of your state, you should try and enforce them consistently on your territory. In my view, it's an absolutely reasonable compromise, which says we make our symbolic point, and actually this point probably applies to 70 or 80% of the population who use mainstream media, but anyone who wants to can get it on google.com.
Can I ask a question? So if we accept these exceptions just as like a symbolic gesture, but we are agreeing on a principle that somewhere, like if for example one day in Iran only google.ir is accessible, then it is not a symbolic gesture anymore. Or if in China only the Chinese version of the Google.
Absolutely, but remember that the Australians wanted to have the Great Firewall of Australia, and some have argued for the Great Firewall of France, so that if we do not accept the absolute sort of neo-Westphalian principle that you can simply totally reimpose national sovereignty by the Great Firewall of Australia. That's not what we're talking about. Could I just go to the point on fragmentation, which I think is a really, really important one? Because I think while there are huge chances here, there are real dangers of fragmentation into what Cass Sunstein calls information cocoons, where everybody only talks to the other 937 people and 37 websites which share the same point of view. And while extreme anti-Islam websites are clearly not to blame for the crazed mass murder by Anders Behring Breivik in Norway, it is the case that he was reinforced in his crazed anti-Islam views by those 37 websites he constantly revisited. So I think preserving something like a Habermasian or at least a BBC public sphere is actually very important.
Could I just respond to a couple of points there? I do think it's important to bear in mind that the big media, the BBCs, the Al Jazeeras, the CNNs, they still dominate the news media scene, and regardless of the amount of social media passing through our brains and through our devices. I mean, if you just take the BBC Arabic service, the television will get 45 million people. The numbers of people on social media are 45,000. They're very, very small. Now, I know that that's just the BBC Arabic service, but we also find that social media aren't actually changing the framing of news. And I think when you look at news and the way it's presented, you have to think about the framing, the perspective, the priorities, and what we found is that social media are actually incorporated into those dominant frames. So I think that's another view, and I think it's also very clear that whilst people are commuting across different kinds of media, there is always a tendency to seek out and have your dominant media, news media diet, tends to be that which confirms your view of the world rather than contests it. I mean, how many people here are going to be, buying the Telegraph or the Times or the Sun,
Heaven forbid. I mean, God, yeah. The Daily Telegraph.
Well, thanks very much. It seems to me that this whole discussion is far too academic. It's missing out some very fundamental points related to economics, for a start. If you're struggling simply to exist, as more than 1 billion people in the world are, if you don't have enough food, don't have access to clean water and all the other things, free speech is the last of your concerns. We've been talking about the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It ain't so. You could argue that a newborn baby isn't completely unfree, but for many huge proportion of the world's population, they remain unfree for the rest of their lives. Article 3, everyone has a right to life, liberty and security of person. Yes, I would actually put that as the very first. The right to life itself is the most fundamental right of all, and I would put that first anyway. Article 25, and this relates to my first point. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, etc., etc. And again, unless you actually tackle the root causes of that, which are in the distribution of wealth throughout the world and in individual countries, as I said right at the beginning, this whole discussion is totally academic.
I'd like to actually respond to your first point. It's a very powerful point, and I take it very seriously. The fact that we cannot feed this. These are not the real concerns of people. People have much more serious concerns about food and hunger and disease. But the interesting thing is that this is exactly what the Mubarak regime was telling us for 30 years. And they were telling us that we cannot, effectively, this is a luxury. Questions of democracy and justice and right is a luxury. And effectively, not only the Mubarak regime, but throughout the Arab world, we were presented with a very dismal option, either security and feeding you, or democracy. We cannot guarantee both. And I think what we have been witnessing really throughout the Arab world, in the countries that has witnessed disturbances in different factions and different fashions, but it is actually unlike what the regimes had predicted, that there will be a revolution of the poor and hungry. These were revolutions inspired by justice and rights and basic rights, and articulated themselves in so many words consistently. It was not about maldistribution of income. It was not about hunger. It was not the inner cities descending on the cities. It was about justice.
Just to make a brief additional point to that, I mean, I spent in much of the last 3 years working for an international development charity, so working for that bottom billion, and actually access to information, freedom of expression, absolutely fundamental to overcoming poverty. If those villagers can't challenge the potentially corrupt local councillor who's not putting the money that's there into the school, into the local health clinic, you don't get the economic rights. So I would actually say to you, yes, absolutely vital, those 1 billion people on less than $1 a day, but the two go together as well. Yes.
I just want to underline what Tim said initially about that we're stuck in this 18th century model of freedom of expression, where it's the state or the church who's going to silence us and chill us. And if you're thinking about a story which was repressed for 10 years, the story of phone hacking at News International, that was chilled by corporate power. So we have a model here of what corporate power could look like on Google and Facebook or Amazon or the acting. But I just want to ask a more specific question about dialogue. And we frame it from that 18th century First Amendment model of freedom of speech. And that does, there's no allowance for that, for the idea of a right to reply, of dialogue. We have a concept of, that you're allowed to speak and not be answered, or the state is allowed to speak to you, or the megaphones of corporate state. That somehow you've got to build into that the concept of, that you have to listen to other people. And that's just briefly on that point about belief you put in. I think that's the key thing. When I've worked a lot on Daily Kos, the big online American site, which self-moderates. The key thing is you attack the argument and not the arguer. That you can separate the content of what somebody says from their identity.
Could I just respond briefly to that? First of all, does money have the right to speak? I mean, the biggest problem in free countries, semi-free countries at the moment, the bigger problem is usually private power. You mentioned Murdoch, Citizens United verdict, which says that corporations have the same speech rights as individuals, meaning that unlimited corporate money can pour into the current US presidential election campaign, and you don't even have to identify the donor. That is a profound distortion, in my view, of what egalitarian freedom of expression should be. On your other point, on the dialogue, and this is really, really important, we have to move from a purely Western defined universalism, a purely Western universalism, which was anything but universal, which in the 18th century did not include women, slaves, and most of humankind who were under European rule, to a more genuinely universal universalism. And the question is, how do you do that? That is the underlying thought of this whole project. In my view, the only way to do it is to put your own propositions on the table, as Immanuel Kant might have suggested, and then be genuinely open, but I stress genuinely open, to what someone from China or Egypt or Russia or Brazil is going to have to say in response, and be prepared to revisit your own assumptions. But I see no other good way to have the debate. Above all, please not the dialogue between civilizations. I think it's a total disaster, because it assumes we're defined by our single civilization.
Absolutely. I think perhaps we should discuss the right to be offended, because I think when people come together and a genuine dialogue takes place, well, that's inevitably conflictual. And to keep harking back to the empirical public sphere that we've been studying through the BBC Arabic, I mean, it's quite clear that online communities can grow and flourish and thrive, and then just as quickly they can collapse into destruction, because as in one example, one member of the community says, "Oh, you're a bashir, you're a liar," and then the other woman, this woman replies, "How dare you call me a liar?" And the other says, "All Syrians are liars." And then this male says, "Well, when a woman speaks in the Arab world, when a man speaks in the Arab world, a woman should shut up." The end of the online community, the end of the dialogue. So, I think there are issues. Stephen Collini has written a very nice little book in the Index on Censorship series by Seabird, and it's called That's Offensive. And he argues that one of the problems that we have today is that too much attention is paid to the notions of respect and to disadvantage, and the idea that we fall prey to a kind of very unhelpful relativism if we don't, if we don't use critical judgment to and reason to judge ideas, and criticism and the right to be offended should be part of any free speech and freedom of expression.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, as we know, the right to offend is not the duty to offend.
No.
But the fact is that in a world where we are, one way or another, getting more and more mixed up together, we're going to have to live with more different opinions and ways of life and views. Yeah. And I actually think that does mean getting slightly thicker skins and keeping a sense of humour. You worked on the British sense of humour. I actually think a sense of humour is very important to that. Can I just...
where does it leave your, don't offend the believer, but offend the believer?
No, but that is precisely, that is absolutely, I'm glad you asked that question, because we spell it out in the explanation. We respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. Now, I'm afraid for this gentleman this is going to get really academic for a moment, but philosophers distinguish between what they call recognition respect and appraisal respect. The former is recognition respect, which means I recognize you fully as a human being, even if I think that your most treasured belief, you, Tom Cruise, believer in Scientology, is a load of complete balderdash, which indeed the writings of L. Ron Hubbard clearly are. So appraisal respect says, I have appraised the content of your belief, and I find it worthy of being taken seriously, which the writings of L. Ron Muhammad clearly are not. So that's it's an absolutely vital distinction which we're trying to get at between respecting you as a human being who holds a belief and the content of the belief.
Isn't that very westernized, on the belief? Because, you know, maybe Khaled can comment on that. There are culture. I'm coming from a culture that many believers, they identify themselves. They define their identity by their beliefs. And offending those beliefs can mean offending the believer. And in a very recent example, a rap song in Iran, which came out, and many people, you know, just got angry. They just threatened the singer to death and all these things. The discussion became very, very personal because people thought they can personally offend the singer because he personally offended something deeply defining their character. I don't know whether in Arab world it's...
Yeah, we can make this argument, but I have to agree. I have to agree with Timothy here that it's not an easy thing, and the argument needs to be made. It needs to be made, and we talked about this when Timothy came in that auditorium. There was one very interesting question from a young woman sitting out the front row, telling the panelists, but you have to respect me too. I mean, okay, we'll hear, you know, all those people talking about freedom of expression, but what do you have to say when I am offended by you? And they didn't engage her. I mean, we don't have, I think, an answer to her question. Privately, Timothy and I told him about an interesting conversation that has to do with religion. But I thought about it on the spot, actually. An argument about how society as such and this woman as a member of society would actually benefit on the long run when she is offended. I mean, that's an old argument, but it's not made publicly. And the example that I thought of instinctively while talking to my driver in Cairo was about the Prophet Muhammad himself, that as we know from the Quran, there is a famous story about how the Prophet's message was offensive to his Meccan fellow citizens. They, and the Quran says this explicitly in so many instances, that the Meccans responded to Muhammad saying, no, you are saying things that we're not used to. These are offensive things we cannot tolerate. And I was making the argument that had this argument won, we would not have had Islam. That it's very important to open up society and accept things that would be offensive on different levels.
You wanted to add it?
Yeah, just a couple of points on that. I think what we see in quite a few circles at the moment is the move towards the tolerance, respect, which is shutting down the debate. So it's saying, okay, I'm going to think you're the believer and the belief, and I'm going to be polite to you, and you're going to be polite to me. And we may go away feeling, oh, she was polite to me, that's nice, but we won't have discussed. We're closing down discussion. So I think that's one issue. But obviously there are very different views on that. The other, just, you know, Tim, with his explanation of the academic, two ways of looking at you know, respecting the person, the rights, but not the views. But of course, sometimes in this business, we're actually defending the right of people who have a view that they want to take away your rights. You know, and as long as they're not inciting violence or in this country we have hate speech. Look at the Golden Dawn neo-Nazi party in Greece. Now that there seem to be, there's a lot of actual violent attacks against immigrants in Athens at the moment. But if it's not violent beliefs, but it's people talking differently to us about rights, again, we're respecting their right. They're not necessarily fully respecting our
Just
right.
if I very quickly on this. If we put together all the taboos of all the religions and faiths and belief systems in the world, there is not much we could talk about. So if you go consistently down the multiculturalist route, which says, you respect my taboo, I respect yours, we won't end up with much freedom of speech. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Very important topic, obviously, but I'm unclear as to the basis of Professor Garton Ash's free space. His BBC public sphere seems to be the way he's arbitrating what he's proposing. Is there is the BBC public sphere actually free enough to cope with what he's talking about? I've been told by the press office at the BBC that you leave your religion at the door, that your religion doesn't impinge on program making and on news values and so on. I was on a program last Sunday, which I was told would be live and then wasn't, that I was the first person to be censored in 5 series of this program. And the word madrasas was cut out of something that I was talking about in terms of education in Kenya, where Christian teachers are being recruited by one madrasa that we definitely know about, because the education is a religious education. It's not preparing kids for the modern world, and parents are asking for other kinds of teachers. Now, the word madrasas was cut out, apparently so as not to offend the Aga Khan, on the say-so of the head of religion, who is a Muslim. So what is this BBC public sphere? And is that really the basis of, a properly discursive future?
Well, first of all, this is a free speech debate public sphere, not the BBC public sphere, and our online editor will actually kill me if I don't once say, please come and join the debate on freespeechdebate.com in any language you like, Twitter on free speech, Facebook, etc. Having said that, I'll come to the BBC. Mariam, is it okay? You're not going to kill me. Yes, I've said that. Please join the debate wherever you are. Okay, here's Mark Thompson talking to us on the BBC in Religion, trying to explain why the Beeb showed Jerry Springer the opera, which has an extremely satirical representation of Jesus Christ as a kind of overgrown baby in a nappy. And I said to him, but you wouldn't dream of doing anything equally satirical about the Prophet Muhammad. And he said, yes, I think that's probably right, we wouldn't. This was picked up all over the place, including this interesting headline in the Spectator, "Should Christians kill Mark Thompson?" Right? Now, this was the Spectator. Now, Mark Thompson's arguments was actually very interesting in this connection. It was, firstly, he as a devout Catholic actually feels some of what several people here were saying, that if you insult my belief, it is like an insult to me. So he has an unusual sympathy for that, unlike most BBC, lefty liberals. Secondly, he said, Muslims in Britain are still, this is his view, a vulnerable minority, and therefore actually there is a case for this inequality of treatment, because, as he said, Christianity in Britain has broad shoulders. I disagree with him.
So do I.
I think that's absolutely wrong, but I'm just explaining to you the argument. But what I did want to say is, I think it's quite a good place to be where you can have a headline published which says, "Should Christians kill Mark Thompson?" And everybody knows it's a joke. Because most countries in the world, if you had a headline like that of the relevant religion relating to the relevant person, it wouldn't be a joke at all. They might actually be killed.
I was going to ask a question about something else, but just apropos of what Tim Garton Ash has just said. Playing in town at the moment is a play by Dennis Potter called Brimstone and Treacle, which I remember 30 years ago seeing the edited tape of, because the public weren't allowed to see it, because the Director General of the BBC at that point, who was not a Catholic, he was actually a Presbyterian, decided that it was not the sort of thing that he'd like to see his mother watching. So I don't think that the BBC in that respect has changed that much. But the question I was going to ask, because we have expertise here and research here, is really about social media and interactive media and the degree to which they actually do extend democracy. Because, and I was thinking of the concept of trending on Twitter, that when something trends on Twitter, you get what is that kind of exponential growth of a particular opinion merely because the medium has the ability to generate that. And I was thinking also of, and you've studied the BBC's World Service quite closely, specifically Arabic, spent a lot of time out of the country, listened to World Have You Say, which got an award last night. Now, increasingly, I was finding it was becoming America Have Your Say, because there was a certain kind of critical mass that was reached by listeners when the topic was an American topic. So to what degree do interactive media and to what degree do social media actually extend democratic expression of opinion, freedom of opinion, and to what degree do they simply act as an amplifier?
That's the billion-dollar question, really, isn't it? And I think if I had to come down on one side, I would say at the moment they're more of an amplifier than an extender of democracy. You mentioned Twitter. I mean, Twitter is increasingly becoming a very, in terms of media, it's top influencers that count. And so you're getting a strata of people who are, even within the BBC, who are constantly referred to and referred back to. So you're almost getting a social media elite whose opinions then have greater publicity than they might otherwise have done. Similarly with, Have Your Say, etc., and some of the well, when we looked at the debates on Have Your Say and on BBC Arabic, we found that despite the global conversation being one of the most important public purposes of the World Service, and by that the World Service means that with the BBC Trust, the operating agreement is that the World Service should engage and connect people in a global conversation that transcends international boundaries and cultural boundaries and enables people to publish, create, publish and share their views and stories. Well, I'm sorry, my my summary evaluation based on quite extensive research we've done over 5 years, and that's within the World Service, is no.
But if we ask that question to Khalid, because what I heard from him was that no, it doesn't. The social media didn't just amplify, it did extend, it helped to create a move towards democracy and citizens.
Can I just say one very quick thing there? That I think with the Egyptian revolution, although a lot of emphasis is placed on Facebook, if you look at what actually happened, you have old and new media, as you were saying, acting together. And so the pamphlets from the mosques, were being circulated among different people, so different media come into play at different moments.
I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? It's when they come together, old and new media. Just very, very quickly, there was a Reuters Institute at Oxford study of the Russian internet, which showed the Russian internet was totally free. This is 3 years ago under Putin. Totally free and totally powerless. It made no difference at all, because the regime controlled all the mainstream media, all the main levers of power. It's when you get Al Jazeera as well and people on the streets.
The phenomenon in Egypt, I mean, I haven't been to other Arab countries in their revolutions, but the phenomenon in Egypt is very peculiar because of the revolution. So yes, the traditional media and Facebook had helped to really make the revolution possible. But somehow once all of this bottled up frustration and ideas and thoughts and trends and politics burst out, what happens in Tahrir, quote unquote, what happens on the street is way ahead of discourse, whether traditional media or, I mean, and even Twitters, even people on, there's this book, Tweeting from Tahrir, or whatever it was called, and people in Tahrir tweeting what is actually happening to them, people, his colleague being shot, and this kind of thing is, in a sense, really lagging behind, even, by half a second. But in general, I think that what we've witnessed over the past 15 months on the street is still to be grasped and understood.
Thank you. One question here and the next there.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment. I don't feel that this distinction between the believer and the belief quite captures the essence of the problem. I mean, first of all, religion is much more than belief. It's practice of various sorts. And secondly, I think the important issue for many believers is not so much whether you can criticize their belief as how it is represented. And the feeling of certainly many Muslims is in the West that what they see and hear in the media is a caricature of the religion that they believe in and practice. And I think Jews have had this experience in the past. I mean, one of the most powerful vehicles of anti-Semitism was the blood libel. The statements that this is what Jews do. God knows it's not only religion. I mean, it happens to homosexuals, it happens to all kinds of people. So I think the issue is not so much are you insulting the person or the believer or the belief, because I think you should be free to do both. The question is your manner of insulting them going to a point where it is going to cause actual violence?
But if I may, I would jump in on that, because your very last few words made the essential point, which is what are we getting at? What do we want to stop? It's the point at which it becomes dangerous. It's actually going to cause violence. So there's a very interesting, sorry, a bit academic again, study by a woman called Susan Benesch, who draws, in my view, a crucial distinction between what she calls dangerous speech and hate speech. All dangerous speech is also hate speech, but not all hate speech is dangerous speech. When does hate speech become dangerous speech? When you have it being pushed out by powerful media to angry mobs armed with machetes in Rwanda or wherever it may be. So it's a question about the specific media, social and political conditions in which hate speech becomes dangerous speech. So I think the answer to that is to look at those conditions, and I think crucially it's about media pluralism.
But I think this believer-belief thing is slightly irrelevant to that, isn't it?
But there's another principle, comrade, on media diversity. So.
If we can get a quick comment from Kirsty.
I just think quickly
Last question.
on that, it's also, but is the speech, the dangerous speech, as you call it, who is causing the violence? When we look at the Jaipur festival and Rushdie, what are the steps over the preceding weeks and at the time that could have calmed it down? How far do you push your defense of freedom of speech? Who is responsible for the violence? And even once you decide, okay, it's now, we haven't managed that process well, we've got to the critical moment and we're stopping him speaking, we're shutting down the Bejti play in Birmingham. It means we've missed the stages in between where it didn't have to be violent. So some speech is obviously clearly and directly inflammatory violence, meaning it when they say go and kill somebody, but others it's the response, so it's again more complicated.
Correct. The question from
Thank you. Mishana Hosseinian, Oxford University. Very nice to see you. I agree that we really do need a global debate about human rights, about free speech. And right now we're lucky enough to have the sort of social networks as platforms to have these debates. But then the question arises, where do we go from there? And how can we make this enforceable? because I do agree that we need a normative system. And let us not forget that we already have a relatively developed normative international human rights regime. I mean, we have very advanced human rights provisions, even in constitutions in the Middle East, that provide for safeguards for freedom of expression. However, the major problem is in implementation. And that is where I believe we do need to be thinking about not a top-down global code of conduct, but maybe a top-down and bottom-up, a joint effort, so that the peoples of the world can hold their governments, including multinationals, accountable for these rights and to be able to demand them legally.
Very quickly, I don't think they should all be enforceable. And even those that are enforceable need not necessarily be enforceable by the same people. I mean, that's part of precisely the discussion, is which of these norms really have to be enforced by the state with its monopoly of legitimate violence. In my book, this one up here, we neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. It's both sides of the coin. So this goes to Kirsty's point. You don't accept violent intimidation as well as not making the threats of violence. Very often the British police end up arresting the wrong people.
It's in response to your question, but also in response to something that Tim mentioned. I mean, the very principle of a global debate. I'm all for it, but I think we have to have local debates as well. I mean, that's absolutely. Again, when if we are really interested in these transitions to democracy, part of the problems that we've had in the Arab world is that we weren't talking to each other. So the difficulties that we are now encountering in various parts of the Arab world is precisely to try and find and define the parameters and the rules of disagreement. And I think somehow this is, it's not that one is more important than the other, but maybe one should come before the other. Somehow I cannot, and I think this is what explains slightly the response you got from these bloggers in Egypt. It's not a question again of you Oxford versus Tahrir, as much as we need to find a way to talk to each other first here in Tahrir before we try and understand how the rules of the game and of Google are.
Thank you so much. There are still a couple of questions, but we are running out of time. Thank you, and thank you for bearing with me. As I said, this was the first time I was doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists.
Oh, thanks a lot.